Imagine you are handed a piece of paper. Just a piece of paper. No army, no territory, no crown on your head. But that paper gives you permission. Permission to sail to the other side of the world, trade with whoever you want, and bring back whatever you find. That's how it starts. Not with a war, not with a king raising a flag, with a piece of paper. And a group of merchants who were very, very good at wanting more. What happens next is one of the strangest stories in all of human history. That piece of paper, that trading license, eventually becomes the foundation of something monstrous. A company. Not a country, not an empire, a company. The kind that keeps accounts, pays dividends, and answers to its shareholders, ends up ruling over 200 million people. It builds its own army, fights its own wars, collects its own taxes. It rewrites the laws of an entire civilization. And when it is finally finished, when the dust settles and the ledgers are closed, it has transferred one of the greatest concentrations of wealth in human history out of India and into Britain. This is not a story about soldiers and glory. This is a story about ambition disguised as business, about greed dressed up in a company uniform, about how a small group of men, starting with almost nothing, dismantled one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth, and how they did it not all at once, but slowly, quietly, one deal at a time. But before we talk about the company, we need to understand what they were really after. Because the India they sailed toward wasn't struggling. It wasn't waiting to be saved. It was, by almost every measure, the richest place on Earth. In the year 1600, when those London merchants were signing their charter and dreaming of faraway riches, India was not a sleeping giant. It was wide awake. And it was magnificent. The Mughal Empire at this moment controlled roughly a quarter of the entire world's economic output. Let that sit for a second. 1/4 of everything the world produced: the silk, the cotton, the grain, the spices, the gold. A staggering portion of it moved through this one civilization. Cities like Agra, Delhi, Lahore, and Surat were not colonial outposts or quiet trading towns. They were beating hearts of global commerce. Agra alone, the seat of the Mughal throne, had a population larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than almost any city in Europe at the time. And the emperor who sat at the center of all this was unlike anything the European world had ever produced. The Mughal Emperor Akbar, who ruled through much of the late 1500s, commanded an empire so vast, so wealthy, so organized, that visiting diplomats from Europe would return home and struggle to find words for what they had seen. His court received ambassadors from Persia, from Central Asia, from the Ottoman Empire, from Portugal. They all came to him. He did not go to them. The wealth of the Mughals was not just impressive, it was almost impossible to imagine by the standards of the time. The peacock throne, built for Emperor Shah Jahan, was encrusted with so many rubies, emeralds, and diamonds that historians have spent centuries arguing about what it was actually worth. The Taj Mahal, which Shah Jahan also built, employed over 20,000 workers for more than 20 years. Not because he needed a building, but because he could. That is what real power looks like. When you build things not out of necessity, but out of sheer, breathtaking abundance. And it wasn't just the emperors. India's merchant class, the traders, the bankers, the textile producers, were running sophisticated financial systems that Europe was still centuries away from fully understanding. Indian traders had credit networks stretching from the Persian Gulf to Southeast Asia. Indian cotton was so fine, so precisely woven, that European buyers described it as woven air. They weren't exaggerating. Muslin from the city of Dhaka was so thin, so delicate, that a full length of fabric could be folded and passed through a finger ring. This wasn't myth. This was the standard. And then there were the spices: black pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, cloves. To us, spices are something we keep in a small jar in the kitchen. To the world of 1600, they were everything. They preserved food in an era before refrigeration. They made medicine. They masked the smell of rot in a world without sewage systems. They were used as currency. A bag of black pepper was worth more than most men earned in a month. And the majority of the world's most prized spices came from, or passed through, the Indian subcontinent. Whoever controlled that trade controlled the pulse of global commerce. The Portuguese had figured this out first. Vasco da Gama sailed around the southern tip of Africa and reached the Indian coast in 1498. When he came back to Lisbon, his ships were loaded with spices worth 60 times the cost of the entire voyage. 60 times. Word spread fast. The Spanish were already in the Americas. The Portuguese had the African route. And the English, cold, damp, commercially ambitious England, was watching all of this from the outside, wanting in, desperate to find their own way to this extraordinary place. But here's the thing that most people miss when they think about this period. India did not need Europe. Indian merchants were not sitting around waiting for British ships to arrive and open up their markets. India was already trading with the Middle East, with China, with Southeast Asia, with East Africa. The Indian Ocean was an Indian world. The British didn't arrive in India to fill a gap. They arrived to take a piece of something that was already working perfectly without them. Now, the Mughal Empire was vast, but vast things are rarely simple. By the late 1600s, cracks were beginning to form. Emperor Aurangzeb, the last of the truly powerful Mughals, had expanded the empire to its greatest size ever. But he had also stretched it past the point where any one man could hold it together. He spent decades fighting wars in the south of India, draining the treasury, exhausting the army, alienating powerful regional rulers who had once been loyal. And when Aurangzeb died in 1707, the Mughal Empire didn't collapse all at once. It fractured. Slowly at first, then faster. Regional powers rose up. Governors stopped sending tax money to Delhi. Warlords carved out territory. The center could no longer hold. And in the corners of this fracturing empire, in the port cities, in the trading posts, in the small fortified warehouses along the coastline, the company was watching, waiting, taking notes. Because they had learned something important in their first 100 years in India. You do not conquer a civilization by attacking it head-on. You wait for it to divide itself, and then you walk through the gap. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the company became something dangerous, it was something almost laughable. A group of hopeful merchants with second-hand ships, questionable maps, and a piece of paper signed by a queen who would be dead within 3 years of signing it. London, December, 1600. The city smells of coal smoke and river mud. The streets are narrow and loud. Merchants argue in coffee houses. Ships creak in the Thames. And somewhere in the cold heart of this city, 218 men put their names on a document that will, though none of them know it yet, change the shape of the world. They call themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. We call them the East India Company. These were not noblemen, not generals, not visionaries with grand theories about empire. They were businessmen, wool traders, spice importers, men who understood profit margins and shipping costs and the price of pepper in a Lisbon market. What they wanted was simple. Cut out the middlemen, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Ottoman traders who sat between England and the East, and get direct access to Asian goods. Buy cheap, sell expensive, repeat. That was the entire plan. There was nothing in that plan about ruling anyone. Queen Elizabeth signed their charter on the last day of the century. She gave them a monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. In return, they would take all the risk themselves. The Crown would not fund the voyages, would not send naval protection, would not guarantee anything. If the ship sank, that was the company's problem. If the crews died of disease, the company's problem. If a rival nation seized their cargo, company's problem. Elizabeth got the reward without the risk. It was, in its own way, a master class in delegation. The first voyages were brutal. The ships were old, the routes were poorly understood. The seas between England and India were among the most dangerous in the world. Men died of scurvy before they even rounded Africa. Ships were lost to storms that don't appear on any map a London merchant had ever seen. The first fleet left England in 1601. 5 ships, nearly 500 men. By the time they returned, the crews were skeletal. Many were dead. The captains had improvised the entire journey, but the holds were full of pepper and spices. And when those goods were sold in London, the profit was enormous, enough to fund another voyage, then another. The losses were terrible. The gains were greater. The company kept going. What they needed, desperately, was a foothold in India itself. Not just to buy goods from passing traders on the open water. They needed somewhere to store cargo, to repair ships, to negotiate directly with Indian merchants and Mughal officials. They needed to be on Indian soil. Getting there was harder than it sounds. The Portuguese had arrived first, and they did not intend to share. Portugal had built its entire Eastern Empire around controlling the Indian Ocean trade routes. They had forts along the coast, warships patrolling the water, and a deep, violent suspicion of any European competitor who tried to move in. The early English voyages to India were not just commercial missions. They were naval confrontations waiting to happen. Then came 1608. A company captain named William Hawkins sailed into the port of Surat on the northwest coast of India. Surat was one of the most important trading cities in the Mughal world. Busy, cosmopolitan, wealthy. The kind of place where fortunes were made on a single good season. Hawkins didn't come to conquer it. He came to ask permission. Permission to trade. Permission to set up a small warehouse. Permission to exist on Indian soil. He went all the way to the Mughal court at Agra to make his case, personally, to Emperor Jahangir. Jahangir was curious about the English, received Hawkins warmly, even seemed to like him. But the Portuguese have their own representatives at the Mughal court, and they whispered in the right ears. The English, they said, could not be trusted. Hawkins left Agra with nothing. The company did not give up. 3 years later, in 1611, English ships defeated a Portuguese fleet off the coast of Surat. It was a small battle by any historical standard, a skirmish really. But the Mughals noticed. If the English could beat the Portuguese on the water, perhaps they were useful after all. In 1612, the company was granted permission to establish a trading post in Surat. A small warehouse, a few rooms, a handful of men living under Mughal authority, operating under Mughal rules, entirely dependent on Mughal goodwill. That was all it was. That was all it was supposed to be. Over the next few decades, the company expanded slowly. More trading posts appeared along the coastline. Madras in 1639, Bombay, acquired remarkably as part of a royal dowry when the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza married the English king Charles II in 1661. Calcutta in 1690. 3 cities, 3 small clusters of warehouses and offices and residential buildings on the edge of the Indian world. The company men who lived there were not rulers. They were guests, sometimes welcome, sometimes tolerated, always operating at the mercy of the powers around them. They paid taxes to local rulers, bribed officials to smooth trade negotiations, walked carefully and spoke politely. They knew that if the Mughal emperor or any powerful local ruler decided he wanted them gone, they would be gone. But something was shifting underneath the surface. The company was making serious money, and serious money attracts serious competition, not just from the Portuguese anymore. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the most powerful trading corporation in the world at this point. Larger, richer, better organized than the English company. The Dutch had locked down much of the Southeast Asian spice trade with ruthless efficiency. The English couldn't compete with them in Southeast Asia, so they focused on India. And as they focused on India, they began to understand something that would change the nature of the entire enterprise. India was not one place. It was not one power. It was a mosaic of kingdoms, sultanates, merchant communities, and regional rulers, all with their own ambitions, their own rivalries, their own enemies. The Mughal emperor was still the most powerful figure on the subcontinent, but even he could not see everywhere at once. In the gaps between powers, in the spaces between loyalties, there was room to maneuver. Then came a decision that seems small in the retelling, but was enormous in its consequences. The company decided it needed soldiers. Not many, just enough, they said, to protect their trading posts, to guard the warehouses, to discourage pirates and local bandits from helping themselves to company property. Reasonable on its face. Any business operating in a volatile environment needs some form of protection. But think about what this actually means. A private company, owned by shareholders, answerable to no government, motivated entirely by profit, now has its own armed forces. Not soldiers on loan from the crown. Not a royal garrison protecting English subjects abroad. The company's own soldiers. Paid by the company. Loyal to the company. Deployed at the company's discretion. In 1668, the company received the right to make war and peace in its own name. Read that again. A trading company, a business, received the legal right to declare war. Nobody in London seemed particularly alarmed by this. They probably should have been, because the next chapter of this story is not about merchants anymore. It is about a young man named Robert Clive. Robert Clive arrived in India in 1744 as a clerk. Not a soldier, not a commander, not a man with any particular plan for greatness. He was 18 years old, miserable, and by his own account, deeply unsuited to sitting behind a desk, adding up numbers in a humid trading post in Madras. He had been a difficult child, restless, aggressive, thrown out of multiple schools. His family, not knowing what else to do with him, had essentially shipped him to the other side of the world and wished him luck. He attempted suicide not long after arriving in India. The gun misfired. Twice. Clive later told people that he took this as a sign, that he had been preserved for something greater. He was right, though whether what followed was greatness or catastrophe depends entirely on where you were standing. What Clive had, what no amount of schooling could have given him, was an instinct for power. He could read a room, read a battlefield, read a man's weaknesses before the man himself knew they were there. When conflict broke out between the company and local rulers in the early 1750s, Clive moved from the counting house to the battlefield almost naturally. He discovered that he loved war. Not the chaos of it, the architecture of it, the planning, the deception, the precise application of force at exactly the right moment. He won battles against numerically superior enemies by moving faster, thinking clearer, and understanding his opponents better than they understood themselves. By his early 30s, he was the most important military figure the company had ever produced, and he was about to fight the battle that would define everything. To understand what happened next, you need to understand Bengal. Bengal in the mid-1700s was arguably the wealthiest province in all of India. The land was extraordinarily fertile, fed by the great river systems of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. It produced rice, silk, cotton, saltpeter. Its textile industry was legendary. Its port city of Calcutta, still a relatively young company settlement at this point, was growing fast into one of the most commercially active places in Asia. Whoever controlled Bengal controlled an almost incomprehensible flow of money. The Nawab of Bengal, the regional ruler operating under the nominal authority of the weakening Mughal emperor, was a young man named Siraj-ud-Dowlah. He was 23 years old when he inherited power. He was proud, volatile, and deeply suspicious of the company's growing presence in his territory. He had reasons to be suspicious. The company had been quietly fortifying its settlements in Bengal without asking permission. They had been granting asylum to people Siraj wanted handed over. They had been abusing a trade exemption, originally granted to the company itself, by selling it to Indian merchants, cutting the Nawab out of tax revenue that was rightfully his. In other words, the company had been behaving not like a guest in Bengal, but like a rival power. Quietly, incrementally, but unmistakably. Siraj decided to make a statement. In 1756, he marched his army to Calcutta and seized the company's fort. The company men fled. Most of them, anyway. The ones who didn't, the ones captured, were locked overnight in a small prison cell in the fort. The cell was tiny, and the night was hot, and by morning, many of them had died of heat and suffocation. The British called it the Black Hole of Calcutta. Whether the numbers were as catastrophic as the company later claimed is debated by historians. But the story, the image of British subjects dying in an Indian prison, was exactly what the company needed. It gave them a justification, and Robert Clive was dispatched to Bengal with a fleet and a mission to take it back. He retook Calcutta easily. Then he did something that had very little to do with military force. He made a deal. There was a man in Siraj's court named Mir Jafar. He was the commander of the Nawab's army, ambitious, resentful, and deeply interested in what might happen if Siraj were no longer in power. Clive found him, reached him through intermediaries, and made him an offer. Betray the Nawab at the right moment. Help deliver Bengal to the company. In return, become the next Nawab of Bengal. Mir Jafar agreed. June 23, 1757, the fields of Plassey, a mango grove on the banks of the Bhagirathi River. Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army numbers somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 men. Clive commands roughly 3,000. By any conventional military calculation, this should be a massacre. The battle begins. Artillery fires, men advance. The noise is enormous and the heat is punishing. And then, at the critical moment, Mir Jafar's forces don't move. Tens of thousands of soldiers, standing still, watching, waiting. They had been told to. Siraj's army, suddenly exposed on its flanks, without the support it was counting on, begins to collapse. The Nawab flees on a camel. He is caught days later and executed, on Mir Jafar's orders. The Battle of Plassey lasted, in real terms, a few hours. It was decided not on the battlefield, but in secret meetings weeks before a single shot was fired. And it changed India forever. Mir Jafar was installed as the new Nawab of Bengal, a puppet ruler, technically in power, genuinely in the company's pocket. And the company collected its reward. Clive personally received £234,000. In today's money, somewhere in the range of £30 million, for one battle. The company itself received territorial rights, trading privileges, and an immediate cash payment that helped fund its next decade of expansion. Bengal had been purchased, not with military genius, with a bribe. But Plassey, as significant as it was not yet the moment the company became a government. That moment came 9 years later, quietly, in a treaty that most people have never heard of, the Diwani. The weakened Mughal emperor, Shah Alam II, desperate, surrounded by enemies, needing the company's military support, granted the East India Company the right to collect revenue from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Not to trade there, not to maintain posts there, to collect taxes from 20 million people. Think about what that means. A trading company, owned by shareholders in London, now had the legal authority to extract money from one of the most densely populated, most productive regions on Earth. It was at this moment, not at Plassey, not at the founding charter, that the company stopped being a business and became something that had no real name. An empire inside a company. A government that answered to a board of directors. And what did the company do with this extraordinary power? Exactly what you would expect a profit-driven organization to do. It extracted. The tax demands placed on Bengali farmers were not designed around what the land could sustainably produce. They were designed around what the company needed to show its shareholders back in London. When the rains failed in 1769, the company did not reduce its demands. When crops withered and food prices rose, the company did not open its reserves. When people began to starve, genuinely, catastrophically starve, the company continued collecting. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed an estimated 10 million people. 1/3 of the entire population of Bengal, dead, in 2 years. Historians argue about how much of the blame falls directly on company policy and how much on the drought itself, but this much is not argued. The company knew people were dying, and it did not stop collecting. Back in London, the men who ran the company were becoming extraordinarily rich. Company officials who had served in India returned home with fortunes so large that English society had no existing category for them. They bought country estates. They purchased seats in Parliament. They commissioned portraits and built libraries and sent their children to the finest schools. They were called nabobs, a corrupted English version of the Indian word nawab. And while some English people admired them, many were deeply uncomfortable. Where did this money come from? That question was starting to be asked out loud. The company was transforming, growing, reaching. After Bengal, it was only a matter of time before the logic of expansion took hold completely. To protect Bengal, you needed to control the territories around it. To control those territories, you needed to neutralize the powers that threatened them. And to do that, you needed more soldiers, more battles, more treaties, more manipulation. The machine, once started, could not stop itself. Mysore in the south, ruled by the formidable Hyder Ali and then his son Tipu Sultan, resisted the company across 4 wars spanning decades. Tipu Sultan fought with a ferocity and strategic intelligence that made him one of the most dangerous enemies the company ever faced. When he finally fell in 1799, the British found him dead in a gateway of his own fort, surrounded by his soldiers. He had refused to surrender. The Marathas, a powerful confederacy that controlled much of central and western India, fought 3 wars against the company before finally being broken in 1818. One by one, the great powers of the subcontinent were absorbed, dismantled, or reduced to dependent states. Each victory fed the next campaign. Each new territory required administration, which required more men, which required more money, which required more extraction. By the early 1800s, the East India Company controlled more territory than any European power had ever held in Asia. It had an army of over 200,000 men, larger than the British Army itself. It ran courts, built roads, issued currency, conducted foreign policy. It was, in every practical sense, a government. A government that had started as a group of merchants asking a queen for a trading license. A government that had never been elected by anyone it ruled. A government whose ultimate purpose, whose reason for existing, was not the welfare of the people under it. It was profit. And the people under it, 200 million of them, were beginning to feel the full weight of what that meant. There is a word that gets used a lot when people talk about the East India Company: administration. It sounds neutral, bureaucratic, almost boring. But what the company called administration, what it wrote up in clean reports and sent back to London in leather-bound ledgers, looked very different from the ground. From the ground, it looked like this. A farmer in Bengal wakes before sunrise. He has farmed this land his entire life. His father farmed it. His grandfather farmed it. The soil knows his hands. But the land is no longer his in any meaningful sense. The company has decided who owns it, what it produces, and how much of that production belongs to the state. The farmer will grow what he is told to grow, pay what he is told to pay. And if the harvest fails, if the rains don't come, if the crop withers, if the river floods, he will still be expected to pay. Because the company's ledgers don't have a column for compassion. The system the company built to extract revenue from Indian land was called the Permanent Settlement in Bengal and various other arrangements across different regions. The details varied. The principle did not. Find the most efficient way to get the maximum amount of money out of the land and into company accounts. In Bengal, the company created a new class of landlords called zamindars and gave them ownership of vast tracts of land in exchange for delivering fixed tax payments to the company every year. The zamindars, to meet their payments, squeezed the farmers beneath them. The farmers, to survive, borrowed money from moneylenders at punishing interest rates. The moneylenders grew rich. The zamindars stayed solvent. The company got paid. And the farmers, the people who actually worked the land, who actually produced everything the entire system depended on, sank deeper and deeper into debt and desperation. This was not an accident. It was a design. But land revenue was only one part of the machine. The company also controlled trade, and what it did with that control was something that still echoes across the world today. India, at the time the company arrived, was one of the greatest manufacturing civilizations on Earth. Its cotton textiles were unmatched. The weavers of Bengal, of Gujarat, of the Coromandel coast produced fabrics that were sold across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. These were not cottage industries. These were sophisticated networks of skilled artisans, people who had spent generations perfecting techniques that no European mill could replicate. When the company arrived, it initially did exactly what a trading company should do. It bought Indian textiles and sold them in Europe. The problem was that Indian cloth was better than English cloth, and cheaper. English textile manufacturers, powerful men with friends in Parliament, did not appreciate the competition. So Parliament acted. Tariffs were placed on Indian textiles entering Britain. Then, outright bans. Indian cloth was taxed out of existence in the British market, while British cloth flooded into India with no such restrictions. The weavers of Dhaka, who had produced the finest muslin in the world for centuries, found their orders disappearing. Their skills had no market anymore. Their looms went quiet,